Welcome. You're joining us for another deep dive. Today, we're tackling a really tough but, well, critically important topic: the severe impacts of street begging, specifically as they affect children. We've been given a source, some excerpts from Impacts of Street Begging on Children, and honestly, it lays out some pretty stark realities. Our mission here in this deep dive is to sort of unpack the most important nuggets from this source and really try to understand how street begging isn't just, a fleeting hardship, but something that fundamentally limits children's futures, trapping them in these potentially lifelong cycles of vulnerability and poverty, too.
Right. And what's immediately clear, I think, from the source is just how interconnected these challenges really are. It paints this picture of various disadvantages just weaving together into a web that, well, just crushes a child's potential from so many angles. It doesn't just list problems, it shows how one leads straight into another.
Yeah, that interconnectedness, it sounds really powerful. So, where does the source kind of start in this web of impacts? What's the first thing it emphasizes?
Well, the thing the report really drives home right away is the educational deprivation. And it's not just saying, oh, children miss school. It explains how being engaged in begging means missing out on, fundamental literacy, numeracy, and those social skills learned during really crucial developmental years. The source points out this creates a gap that is incredibly difficult, almost irreversible to bridge later on.
Wow, irreversible. That's powerful framing. And because they're missing those like
Yeah.
foundational building blocks, how does the source say that links to other vulnerabilities?
Precisely. That's the link. The source highlights how lacking that structured environment, just basic knowledge, makes them tragically more susceptible to health crises.
Mm.
Being out on the streets exposes them to harsh conditions, poor sanitation, malnutrition. These aren't just temporary discomforts. The report details how this leads to chronic health issues that impact their physical and cognitive development long term, which, of course, further erodes their capacity to ever properly engage in formal learning or work later.
Okay, so you've got a child who's already disadvantaged educationally, struggling with health, and then the source brings in this layer of social stigma. How does the report describe that specific barrier? What does that look like?
Yeah, it's a critical piece of this whole web. The source explains that the social stigma, it isn't just about feeling judged, right? It's about how society's negative perceptions actively lead to discrimination, actual discrimination. And this discrimination then creates really practical barriers. It makes it incredibly difficult for children from these situations to access support services or get decent jobs, even if they somehow gain skills, or just reintegrate into mainstream society. It isolates them even further.
Right. I see how that feeds right back into the cycle because they're isolated by the stigma and already physically and educationally disadvantaged. The source makes it clear this puts them at, well, immense risk, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And this raises a really important point the source emphasizes: the increased vulnerability.
Yeah.
Just being on the streets, being marginalized, it exposes these children to severe dangers: exploitation, physical and sexual abuse, trafficking. The report really underscores that this isn't some theoretical risk. It's a constant daily threat. It causes deep trauma and significantly diminishes their capacity to ever build a stable future. The environment itself is predatory.
Wow. Seeing how the source links that educational gap and the health struggles directly to that increased vulnerability, and then how the social stigma just reinforces their isolation, it really does seem to lock them into very limited prospects.
Exactly. Yeah. The source basically concludes that without those basic building blocks, education, health, safety, social acceptance, sustainable employment becomes almost impossible. They just lack the skills, the physical well-being, the safety network, often even the required documentation or sort of social standing to compete in the formal job market.
So it's undeniably clear from the source that these aren't just isolated issues, they're interconnected barriers. They create a cycle that is incredibly hard for a child to break free from alone. The report does touch on solutions, though, doesn't it? It suggests community support, government intervention, family stability. Things like that are needed.
It does. It highlights that breaking this really complex cycle requires coordinated efforts across multiple fronts, focusing on providing education, ensuring protection, addressing those health needs, and creating genuine opportunities. The source really emphasizes that, fragmented approaches just aren't likely to succeed against such a tightly woven web of disadvantage. It needs to be joined up thinking.
Right. So what does this all mean for you listening? Consider this. The source makes it starkly clear that the impacts are systemic. They build barriers that are almost insurmountable for a child on their own. So maybe something to think about after this deep dive is, what role does societal perspective or maybe collective action play Does it reinforce this incredibly difficult cycle the source describes, or could it potentially help disrupt it?